Hi and welcome to another video of mine, this time focusing on my very new, currently still in progress build of another Range Rover. You may recall from previous videos that I have just done, I've already got one Range Rover which is built on a much more classic theme. It was based off an axial SCX 10.2 chassis, running initially Vanquish portals, which I subsequently converted to extra speed axles in order to have the body shell sit lower and look more realistic. That truck ran also on scale Doctor tires, which are not great for performance but look very scale from my perspective. With the second build of Range Rover, I've decided this time round that it would be a slightly more performance-oriented build. I'd learned a fair bit after I purchased the Vanquish VS410 Pro chassis, and I was using that specific truck for learning how to do more technical crawling, rocks, etc. With that, I said this time round the Range Rover would be a performance-oriented build, not necessarily able to do very technical things because the shell is so heavy, but it would be, from my perspective at the very least, a build which would have more competency, allowing me to go on slightly more technical trails and also ensuring that from my perspective I wouldn't be worrying so much about whether the thing was going to actually fall, roll over, etc. quite so readily. From that perspective, the problem is most arches that I found merely extended the arch well outwards but did not increase the actual diameter of the arch, which would have allowed for more clearance of the larger tires. There was one exception, and for me that exception was the loops. Now there are probably others, but unfortunately I, in my limited searching, didn't find them. So I purchased these loops arches. The two things that work for them from my perspective: one, they allowed for cutting of the arches to be significantly larger than the original arches, effectively pushing the arches right to the limit of the under infrastructure of this body shell, which in turn then gave increased clearance but did not compromise the body shell's strength at all. Second very important thing from my perspective was that these are made of a very good black rubber material. What that means again is if I am going to tight areas where the body shell scrapes along these arches, there's not going to be a requirement for touch-up paint because these are molded black. They are black. So effectively, if they get scratches, they will remain black. The chassis itself, I will show you in a little bit, but it was not an axial chassis this time round that I decided to use, but rather the Vanquish VS410 chassis, because that has a much higher clearance for suspension, which in turn means that I can let the truck sit lower. There is no clashing effectively of the axles to the chassis plate. Body-wise, it's a more aggressive look than the first body that I made. The first was a much more classic looking truck. This time round, I went with a more modern front end. The bumper, I've yet to decide what I'll use, but it'll be an aggressive looking bumper, probably with a bull bar of some sort. Yet to find the perfect one. This is just temporary. We've got the flared arches as we mentioned before. I've removed the holes from where the front rear view mirrors sat because firstly, they always broke off, and secondly, because it's a more modern body shell in terms of the year of production, and as a result of that, I decided that I would use these rubber optional side rear view mirrors that you can buy from JS Scale. I think it was from JS Scale. I'll have to double check that. Body itself was painted using Tamiya paints. Multiple coats of clear as well, with a lot of hand polishing, because I wanted this specific body to be a new looking body. There was going to be no weathering. I wanted this body shell to look new, and the reason was this one was going to be a bit of a thematic body. It was going to tie up to the driver, and in this case I had only one choice of driver for this particular truck, and that was Mr. Miyagi. Why? Well, look at him. I mean, firstly, he looks great inside this specific Range Rover. But second and more important, you can't go with the regular 7-odd-inch figures in a Range Rover. It's just too big. The shell is just too big. You need to go for the bigger 8-inch style figures for them to start to look proportionate within this shell. This shell, I'm pretty sure, is closer to a 1/8, if not at the very least it's a 1/9 scale shell. And because of that, I needed to have the bigger figure. The problem is, if I was to put a bigger figure into this shell, because of the way the Vanquish chassis is designed, the batteries sit here. And with the battery sitting here, the legs of a normal proportion gentleman would have to be cut off. And I don't like to do that if I don't have to. And in this case, I figured if I could find a figure who is representing a very short real-life character, that would be a possible option. And indeed, if you look at this, because of the way Mr. Miyagi is that short, I've got a fair bit of clearance there. So that is the perfect proportion and the perfect figure if one wants to use a full-sized figure of appropriately scale dimensions within this shell without cutting the guy's legs off. Now, the shell itself, what I love about it is because it's got the opening front bonnet, and it's a pretty big front bonnet at that, allows for access to the battery. So in the case of my first build, the battery, because it was based off an axial, had an elongated battery, which was very easy to take out. This one, because they want to lower the center of gravity in the design of the VS410 chassis, the battery sits here, right near Mr. Miyagi's legs. What that also means is that as a result, you can only use a smaller sized battery with this shell, about 4,300 mAh, to cell. And with a bit of dexterity, you can actually get that battery just nicely snuggled in here, slid into place, and hidden in there. It helps because you don't have to take the shell on and off each time when you want to change the battery. And that's a big plus for this specific build. I like leaving body shells on trucks wherever possible, unless it's a pure technical fun driving truck, such as my VS410 Pro, which I will show in another video one day. That one, I put magnets on the shell, and then that just becomes easier. On and off, I don't mind where everything is. And I'll show that specific build another time. I've carpeted the interior. I've actually also fully lined the roof, full detailing of the dashboard, etc. There will be some work still required to cover up the motor, to cover up the transmission, to cover up the shock absorbers, etc. in the back. But that we might do now, we might do later. I'm not sure yet. Still have to finish the shell. I still haven't got the rear window in place yet. But other than that, it's pretty much getting there already. Maybe just a bit of details like the keyhole, etc. So let's get under the shell. Looking underneath, you can see that what we have is the Vanquish VS410 conversion chassis kit. This forms a wonderful basis for a relatively well-balanced chassis, and I tell you, I'm very impressed with the handling of the VS410 Pro. This is not exactly the same, but it has many of the very similar design cues from it, and these include the very high clearance suspension, a constant focus on a very low CG. So battery sits as low as is possible down here, not like in the axial, which has a battery sitting up here. The motor is a very key piece as well, because it uses the similar design to the original axial SCX10 transmission, which houses the motor nice and low. Unlike the axial SCX 10.2 two-speed transmission, that two-speed transmission has a motor that sits much higher. On top of that, it's got a lot more complication in the transmission, and it's something that really we don't need. So this specific build uses a fully Vanquish built transmission, all Vanquish internals with a 2-speed dig, but based off the original Axial SCX10 base design, which was also very similar transmission design. And in fact, it was the same design as the transmission for the ready-to-run Axial SCX 10.2. Low CG is key, and it really is a key reason as well why I've gone with this specific chassis this time round. I have bought myself a set of brand new portals by Vanquish as well for this specific build. Again, I guess this is almost becoming my take on the SCX 10.3, what I think it should have been. Lower CG, full built portals, using, to me, still a 1-speed transmission, but brushless. Shock absorbers, rather than going with Vanquish, I decided I'd go with the Pitbull Chronics. Heard a lot of good things about them and decided it would be well worth my trying them out on this specific build. Now, one thing to take note of is on these scale builds, and in fact actually all my builds in general, I'm now starting to learn that rather than using these recommended very lightweight oils, especially if you're using a hard shell, you need a heavier weight shock, because it allows for a slower rebound and in turn just gives that truck a more realistic look. It's also more predictable. It doesn't make the truck bounce around so ridiculously. In this case, if I remember right, I'm using about a 2000 CST oil. In the more technical truck that I have, which I use for more technical driving, that uses a 1500 CST, which is still very high compared to what is recommended, but it works for me, and that's why I like it. It just looks more realistic. Things aren't bouncing around so quickly. You can see it's a much slower rebound. We're using the Mamba X ESC, Holmes Hobby Puller Pro motor in this case again. And besides that, it'll be able to be running my usual Futaba full radio system. There's still parts to be completed underneath, as you can see, and in this case the center shafts will be the MIP shafts because they are absolutely bulletproof, strong as anything, and I don't want to have to worry about them. Other than that, we're waiting on the Method 1.9 wheels, which will be coming, and they will be put onto this. I have tested Method 1.9s with the Hyrax tires already. I pulled those off one of my other trucks to see how they clear the body shell, and they were perfect. So I'm very, very happy with how that's turned out. I will say that those loop arches are really perfect. Let me just show you the underside of the arches so that you can better understand why I've chosen them. If you look at the clearance that these loop arches allow, we've had a huge amount of cutaway of the shell, both front and rear. On top of that, what I've done in this specific case is I've cut away the lower hangs on the front fender just here on both sides, which gives it a cleaner appearance, but more important, when the tires are turning in this direction, this is full clearance. So these are really fantastic arches. They're perfect for the purpose of putting big tires onto the JS scale body shell. So there you have it. This is the second build in progress. As and when it gets closer to completion, I'm sure I'll be showing more videos of it. I'm very excited to complete this build. I would love to see how this handles with a different chassis, with the higher clearance suspension, with the portals in place. And most important, using those big Hyrax tires that I really do love. I will be very happy to hear your comments on where you think I might improve this. And in particular, I am looking for some options in terms of optional front bumpers. I'll bring you more as I progress this build, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. In the meantime, please do take care of yourselves in this crazy time.